He may be chairman. He's either here or be chair of strategic forces.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to our program, We Win and They Lose, a conservative strategy to win the new Cold War. Please welcome Victoria Coates, Vice President of Heritage's Davis Institute for National Security and Foreign Policy.
Well, welcome everyone here in person and our friends online to the Heritage Foundation, and thank you for joining us to celebrate the publication of a very important new book, We Win, They Lose, Republican Foreign Policy and the New Cold War, which is, I think, going to be one of the foundational documents going into this election year, because we're in the unique situation of being able to compare and contrast the national security and foreign policies of our two now candidates. We have had basically 3 years pre-COVID of President Trump. We've now had 3 years post-COVID, essentially, of President Biden. And I think the stark differences between those two records are becoming extremely clear. I was looking at a statistic today that over the course of the last 3 years, we have had partial or full evacuations of some now 11 embassies stretching around the world from Haiti to Burma. And that is an extraordinary record. Obviously, this can happen in any given hotspot, but to have a world with 11 problems like that in a 3-year span is unprecedented. And I think we can say that is literally a world on fire. So I'm looking forward to exploring the book today with its two authors, Matthew Kroenig and Dan Negrea, as well as Kimberly Reed. They all have very long and distinguished bios. I will just give you a couple of highlights. For starters, Matt is Vice President and Senior Director of the Atlantic Council Scowcroft Center for Strategy and Security, and the Council's Director of Studies. He is currently a commissioner of the Congressional Commission on the Strategic Posture of the United States, and he is also a tenured professor of government and foreign service at Georgetown University, and we will not hold that against him. Dan Negrea is the Senior Director of the Freedom and Prosperity Center, also at the Atlantic Council. He was the State Department's Special Representative for Commercial and Business Affairs between 2019 and 2021. Previously, he was a member of the Secretary of State's Policy Planning Office between 2018 and 2019. And I wanted to note that Dan actually defected from communist Romania, where he had been an official in the Ministry of Finance and was involved with the World Bank and the IMF, which gives him, of course, a very personal relationship with the topic we're discussing today. Kim Reed served as president and chairman of the board of directors of the Export-Import Bank of the United States from 2019 to 21. Prior to EXIM, Chairman Reed spent her career working at senior levels in both the public and private sectors. For example, she served as president of the International Food Information Council. At the Department of Treasury, she headed the Community Development Financial Institutions Fund and also served as senior advisor to the Treasury Secretaries John Snow and Henry Paulson. So with that, I would like to welcome our three panelists to the stage, and we will get going with our discussion.
Sit here. There we go. Let this start. Center.
Questions, and I need my timeline because we have a very specific schedule. All right, Matt, I think I'll start with you. And my publisher told me you always start with the title of a book when you're doing these discussions. So why was We Win, They Lose a radical proposition in 1977?
Well, and before I answer, I just want to thank you and Heritage for having us here. And the book is published this morning. This is our first public event, and wanted to do it at really the home of the conservative movement here at Heritage. So it's an honor to be here. Thank you very much. So, Reagan came to office at a time when détente was the prevailing strategy for the United States and the Soviet Union, really masterminded by Nixon and Kissinger, and then continued in modified forms by his successors, Ford and Carter. And essentially the idea was that the United States was in decline, that the Soviet Union was growing more powerful, and that the best the United States could do would be to try to stabilize the relationship, kind of a peaceful coexistence, lock in strategic nuclear parity with arms control agreements and other things. And so that was the prevailing point of view. And when Reagan on the campaign trail was asked what his strategy is for the Soviet Union, he said, well, simple, some might say simplistic, but it's we win, they lose. And so it was a shocking statement at the time, but I think having a clear goal like that in a long-term strategy is important. Reagan was elected shortly thereafter, pursued that clear strategic goal for 8 years, and by the end of the Reagan presidency, he'd essentially succeeded in that goal of winning the Cold War.
And it is, I mean, it's amazing to think back at it and the extent to which détente was the establishment foreign policy consensus in Washington. And there's a reason my old boss, Don Rumsfeld, called his chapter on that topic in his book, Skunk at the Garden Party, which is frequently a position we find ourselves in here at the Heritage Foundation. We wear our white stripes proudly. Dan, and I was wondering if you could comment from your perspective, particularly, how did Reagan win the Cold War? So what were the tools that he brought to bear that were effective in breaking down the Soviet Union and bringing the United States to victory?
Well, let me start with two introductory statements. First of all, it's an immense honor for me to be at the Heritage Foundation. It is the mothership of the conservative movement. If I were to, there are many Catholics here, so I'll give you an analogy that resonates. I feel like a priest saying Mass at St. Peter's with the College of Cardinals in attendance. So and also a disclaimer, both Matt and I worked at the Atlantic Council, which is a nonpartisan think tank, and my comments are going to be partisan. So they're mine, not necessarily of the Atlantic Councils. Probably the most important thing that Reagan contributed to the discussion at that time that determined the victory of America and of the free world in the Cold War was clarity that the Soviet Union was an evil empire, that there was no moral equivalency, which was one of the implications of détente. They are a major power, we are a major power, we need to coexist. He said, no, we are a shining city on the hill. We stand for freedom, the freedoms given to us by our Creator. And that's an even empire, so that's number one. Number two, clarity that we were in an existential fight in a Cold War. And in our book, we have this concept that we are in a Cold War in the subtitle. Mm-hmm. And in many places where we've started doing podcasts already, and I always start by saying, we are in a Cold War. Not everybody accepts it. But at the Heritage Foundation, I have a problem. I went in the hallway, and this is what I found. So I think I'm safe here. I'm sorry?
There's a larger version.
There is a large, okay, well, so I'm safe. So I think we needed it then, and we need it now, this clarity that we are in a Cold War. If we accept this premise, important policy decisions follow from that.
And thank you for plugging. Or I think Andrew's very happy about that. Now, for Kim, if you could put on your XM hat and talk to us a little bit about how economic warfare plays into the new Cold War and how to complement the strategy that Dan and Matt are laying out. What tools as a director of XM or the other tools we have at Treasury and other commerce, other elements in the government, would you deploy in the service of this national effort?
Absolutely. Before I answer your question, I'd like to add something to the bio you read about me. 30 years ago, very important job I had. I was an intern here at the Heritage Foundation.
Okay, all interns.
So all of the interns work hard. It's a great place. And I also want to thank Dan. He and I were in Romania in the fall, and he took me to the church where he was baptized. And so to hear and see firsthand what his life was like under communism and the bravery that he showed to now become an American citizen and to be here with Matt to celebrate this book, fantastic. The Export-Import Bank of the United States is a very important tool in the trade toolbox when it comes to furthering our nation's economic and national security. And it's just one tool. And there are many examples of how it's been used, including Ronald Reagan. When he first took office, he did a waiver to allow a purchase of nuclear equipment in Romania for the Romanian citizens. And I had the honor of actually looking at that document and then hearing about it firsthand when I was in the Trump administration. It's very important to support things like Heritage hosted last year the former premier of the Solomon Islands, Daniel Sudani. And I had a question asked. He was speaking on China's influence in the Pacific Islands. And I had a question asked because I'd read that the China Export-Import Bank provided a $66 million loan so the Solomon Islands could have 161 Huawei communication towers built. And that is an example of where the United States Export-Import Bank should have been filling the gap. This happened in 2022 when I was no longer in my role. But we need to use these tools strategically. And how do we figure out what that should be? We need to look at what the world is doing. And when it comes to Export-Import Bank, I know there's a big debate within the conservative movement on this, but the playing field of the world is not level. And when you have China using debt trap diplomacy to take over key strategic interests to our national security detriment, we need to be there. And so President Trump made the bold choice to reopen XM after it had nearly been shut for 4 years, and we had lost a lot of deals of where we could have sold our goods and services around the world. He made the bold decision to reopen it by nominating me and my fellow board members so we could approve the deals. And going forward, Dan served at the State Department. He had this brilliant concept called the deal team and worked on it very hard, cross-government, whole-of-government response to needs around the world. And I hope that continues. We need to be one-stop shopping when it comes to providing national security tools in key strategic locations. And the rest of the world, our competitors, are doing that. So we really need to work hard on that. And so much is happening today that we read in the news. But I really want to challenge Congress and those doing oversight, like at this think tank. And Victoria, you do outstanding work. Money's being spent. Things are happening in the press, but what is actually being delivered? And if you are having deals being celebrated, but they don't get to the finish line for whatever reason, we need to be highlighting that because our country, as the book notes, needs to be first. And I hope that it's going to happen.
Those are all excellent points, and I hadn't realized this was going to become the Andrew Harding show, but just to brag on our staff a little bit, Andrew led the effort at Heritage to get the COFA agreements with the Pacific Islands passed and fully funded, and the president signed them into law, which is one of the best things he's done in his entire first term. So I thank you for referencing that as well. And another thing I was interested in the book, Matt, is your referencing of President Trump's 2017 national security strategy, which I'm partial to because I worked on.
It's a great document. Congratulations.
Thank you. Well, it was a heavy lift, but what was interesting about that document, I just want to do a little sidebar, is that President Trump took the unprecedented step of personally announcing it. That traditionally that was the role of the National Security Advisor, then General H.R. McMaster, but that the president decided he was so pleased with the 2017 NSS, he had a public event to announce it. So the idea that that document is somehow an academic production that took place absent the president's intervention and approval is simply false. But why is that document important, and what is great power competition?
Yes, well, I was at the event where President Trump announced the document, and I think it was important because we had this 20-year period, even longer after the end of the Cold War, where I think many people thought that great power competition had come to an end. There was a lot of hope that we could cooperate with Russia and China, incorporate them as responsible stakeholders into the rules-based international system. The national security focus for 20 years after 9/11 was counterterrorism, counterinsurgency. And so I think that document was important by clearly stating that no, great power competition with Russia and China is the foremost challenge facing the United States. And then often national security strategies are laundry lists of all the things administration wants to do. And so I think that document was also special in that it explicitly said what the priorities are not, explicitly said that counterterrorism and counterinsurgency is no longer the priority. So I think that just as Reagan recognized that we were in a Cold War with the Soviet Union, Trump was the first one to recognize, in the Trump administration, that we're in a new Cold War with Russia and China. One of the reasons we wanted to write the book and why we selected the title is that even though I think that Trump was right to recognize that we're in strategic competition, the Biden administration continuing that, Dan and I were feeling like we hadn't really set a clear goal yet. What are we trying to achieve? Is it competition forever? Is it some kind of peaceful coexistence? And we thought that Reagan was right in the first Cold War. The goal should be we win, they lose. And that also works as a goal for this new period of great power competition. And we spell out in the book what that means. But essentially, well, Mike Pompeo writes a foreword for the book. We're honored to have his foreword. And he had a nice turn of phrase. He said that essentially we lay out that we want to get to a position where China either voluntarily capitulates or is incapacitated. So essentially get to a place where they lack the ability or the will to threaten America's vital interests. And that would be victory in our point of view.
And interestingly, on a recent trip to Asia, I believe a colleague in Japan used the phrase that this is a tug of war. And that's kind of resonated with me, and I've been thinking about it, that you're yanking on, and there's this period of stasis, which is sort of the competition period, where everybody's just trying to get a little bit more purchase, a little bit more leverage, and then suddenly at the end, the victor is able to just take gravity into their own hands and win. And I think that's kind of where we are right now. Dan, it might surprise folks to have you link President Reagan and President Trump. There's a prevailing establishment wisdom that President Trump didn't have a foreign policy or a doctrine or was entirely transactional, despite what I from my extremely biased position, would see as significant successes during his first term. But in the book, you talk about a Reagan-Trump fusion. What is that, and how might it manifest in a second Trump term?
So there is this impression that the Republican party is hopelessly divided, split, can't unite. We are in an election year.
I read about it in the paper.
Here in the States, yeah. So we need a united Republican Party to win the election, and we need a united Republican Party to govern. And what Matt and I are saying in the book is that the Republican Party, despite comments in the press, is actually more united than disunited. And on the fundamental issues, there is a consensus. And we put them in three categories. First of all, peace through strength. And you were talking about contrast with the Biden administration. Peace through strength, the idea that the United States must have a military superiority that is such that no adversary would even think about challenging the United States militarily, is something that both the Reagan wing and the Trump wing of the party are agreeing on. And talking about the Biden administration, the recent National Defense Authorization Act talks about the 1% increase in defense spending, which after inflation is really a cut in defense. The other thing, and in the 2017 NSS was something very new, was the idea that economic security is national security. Very catchy phrase, very, very true, very important as a guiding principle. And we believe that both the Reagan wing and the Trump wing agree that we need to move from free trade to fair trade, number one. And number two, that we need to use the energy strength that the United States has and need to move, again, in a contrast to the Biden administration, move away from the climate obsession to having a way in which, to unleashing the energy industry power that the United States has. And finally, American exceptionalism. How can we ask our young men and women in uniform to risk their life for a country that doesn't deserve it? There is this image that one often gets from the progressive side of our political life, that America is a sexist, racist, homophobic, climate polluting, oppressing nations around the world, and so on and so forth. And the two wings of the Republican Party agree that America is great. It's exceptional, and it deserves to be put first. So we believe that there is this consensus. And then you have the Ukraine issue where one can see differences, but we believe that even on Ukraine there is more agreement than disagreement.
Well, thank you for that, and we will definitely come back to both Ukraine and the climate energy issue, but your comment about economic security being national security, I think is a natural for Kim, and I was wondering if you could look at it basically from two different angles. One, what do we need to do domestically to ensure our ongoing fiscal responsibility or fiscal strength? And certainly, the budget fights that we're going through right now, you have a group who are very concerned about deficit spending primarily. The deficit itself is bad, but the spending is what's really killing us, in my opinion. But then also, what could we be doing that would exacerbate China's very serious economic problems that they are trying to navigate? It seems to me that we might have an office that spends all day, every day, figuring out what's wrong with China and trying to make it worse. And we're not doing that. So I'm just curious on your thoughts.
Well, I look forward to the next administration, and I know here at Heritage, we have a great guy, Russ Vought, who is Trump's former head of OMB, who's involved with Project 2025. And as a conservative, I know we take seriously our debt and our deficit, and it's just so troubling that we're at $34 trillion now. And we're gaining $1 trillion in debt every 100 days. And the world knows this, and we've got to get our arms around it. And Speaker Johnson, I know, is working hard on it, so I hope we get to a resolution soon. But we need leadership at the top in the executive branch as well, in delivering budgets that are under budget. When it comes to China, we have a lot of great things, public and private and very private, constantly watching what's happening. But just from my role at XM, we knew that China was doing more in financing than the rest of the G7 countries combined. And it was too good to be true deals. And so a lot of those are blowing up and faltering. And China's got to really get its economic house in order. And what do I have to say on that? The United States should prosper and take advantage of strategic opportunities. And not only with XM, but across government. We need to be acting swiftly. I've heard so many complaints from potential buyers who want to buy made in the USA goods and services, or banks around the world who need XM's loan guaranteed to be able to make a transaction happen. The United States has so much red tape, so much bureaucracy. We act so slowly. And I know as a conservative, we champion smaller government and less regulation. And we really need to put that into practice. And I think that someone needs to be holding everyone's feet to the fire. If it's not Congress, if it's not Inspector Generals, it needs to be the President of the United States saying, let's get it going. We need to protect taxpayers, but so much red tape not only hampers U.S. businesses from thriving, it forces the world to go to other countries, be it France or the UK or China. And I think that's going to be a top initiative come January 20th, 2025.
Agreed, and thank you for mentioning Project 2025. One of which you might also have read about in the newspaper. It is not a dark, sinister conspiracy to overthrow American democracy. We actually wrote a 900-page book and published it about the plans that Heritage is putting together for a potential conservative incoming administration. So there's a lot of information about that on our website. So please do look at that if you're interested. I wanted to turn now to the two sort of problem sets that you define in the book, both the nation-state actors, not surprising group, China, Russia, North Korea, and Iran, all of whom are causing a lot of trouble, but then also transnational threats, allies and institutions, energy and climate, and border security and immigration. And I thought for these three questions, I would get everybody's views on them, because you could come at them from a number of different angles. And what struck me about the nation-state bad actors is that they, to my eye, are increasingly metastasizing into a single problem set. Their collaboration is in many ways a forced marriage, as they are increasingly isolated from the rest of the world. And they all have, as we were just discussing, some pretty significant internal problems, economic, demographic, and other. So those collaborations between them aren't all that pretty. But at the same time, that is how they are gaining strength. And so I was wondering if we could talk about that a little bit in terms of Ukraine and how China's role in Ukraine has not been, I think, fully teased out, particularly for, well, we'll get into that in the energy and climate space. And then also, if we can start with Ukraine, but I'd like to talk a little bit about India and how we deal with a partner critical, I think, perhaps developed ally who's going to be the biggest, or is now the biggest country in the world. We want them to be a democratic ally of the United States, but yet they also, and they are the enemies of China, which is nice, but they're also friendly with Russia. So it creates a new problem set. So Matt, if you want to start with Ukraine, and we can work our way through that in India.
Sure. So starting with the state-based threats, we talk about China, Russia, Iran, North Korea, and we are very clear that China is the greatest threat among the group, 18% or so of global GDP compared to America's 25%. So getting too close for comfort. Russia, less than 2% of global GDP, so doesn't pose the same kind of, just doesn't have the same kind of capacity. But as we point out, they are increasingly working together. And in fact, the coordination among these four autocracies today is greater than the coordination among the Axis powers before World War II, and the Axis powers were able to cause a lot of trouble. So I think we should be worried about the connections among these countries. And China is supporting Russia's war in Ukraine. Just days before the war, they said we have a no-limits partnership. The Biden administration and others have been very focused on is China providing lethal aid, and that's important, but China's also providing a lot of non-lethal aid that's helping Russia in its war aims, providing super heavy-duty trucks. Exports from China to Russia have increased 1,000% since the war. Exports of digging equipment increased 1,000% since the war. So China's literally giving Russia the ability to dig in and hold territory in Ukraine. They're also supporting them diplomatically, providing an economic lifeline. And I think it's because China does want a strong Russia that can threaten the United States, pin it down there to give it a freer hand in the Indo-Pacific. So I do think that stopping Russia and Ukraine is important in its own right, but also important for the competition with China. China wants a strong Russia. We'd be better off with a weaker Russia.
Sure. Dan?
So your question is, as they say in the military, target-rich environment. Lots of interesting things to talk about. So we talk in the book about Ukraine. We do not talk about India, but let's talk about Ukraine. And again, the question of the division between Republicans on this issue. First of all, I salute the heritage position that we cannot give a blank check. I remember at the time when that was put out initially, it caused some head scratching.
We did notice that.
You did notice that. But it was the right thing to note. And what we emphasize in the book is that money to Ukraine needs to be sent as part of a plan, as part of a strategy where we know what the end game is. The issue with the Biden administration is that what we are getting is this idea that we will stay on the side of the Ukrainians until the end. What does the end look like? We don't know. How long? We don't know. I prefer the position that was taken by President Trump and various people who are talking to him, that the first priority should be to stop the killing, stop the fighting there, get to a situation where the people of Ukraine can develop their country, can get back to some level of normalcy. The losses are horrendous. But also it's in the interest of the United States not to have a conflict in Europe. So let's start with that, and then there are many aspects on that. I cannot resist commenting on India. India, we would love India to be a declared supporter of the United States. India doesn't want to take sides. We are seeing, as a consequence of the 2022 invasion of Ukraine, the reappearance of, as we had in the first Cold War, a free world, a group of autocratic countries, but also the reemergence of a new non-aligned movement. And India seems to be there. What is helping us is the fact that the Chinese are doing horrible things that are against their interests often. They somehow manage to antagonize all their neighbors. Somehow they are, for the moment, doing well with the Russians, but they're antagonizing India. And India, by necessity, is getting closer to us in the Quad and otherwise. They want to maintain relations, good relations with Russia for two reasons. Number one, for weapons. But the other reason is they're concerned about China, and they want Russia on the other side as a potential counterweight. What the United States needs to do is to continue to be a strong partner to India and encourage them to be on our side. But I think the aggressive, belligerent behavior of China will push India more and more in our direction.
If I could, I agree with everything Dan said. If I could just add a somewhat humorous anecdote. I was in India last month at the Raisina Dialogue, and on the Russia weapons issues, many Indians said, well, we're not so sure we want the Russian weapons anymore. We see that they're not working that well in Ukraine. So.
I think that is an excellent point, and that, you know, I sympathize with India's desire to not choose a side. I mean, I would like to also not choose a side, but I think, unfortunately, that increasingly is going to be an impossible situation for a whole host of reasons.
So
you
are the national security expert. I'm going to bring this more from an economic perspective to the question and some real conversations. So again, I was at Heritage and met with the ambassador from Ukraine to the United States. And she said to me, Kim, we really wanted to buy Boeing airplanes, but your U.S. Export-Import Bank was closed. And we needed those planes, and we needed financing to help make that happen because planes are very expensive. And there's so much small components and small businesses that put things, as we know, into large planes. So what did she end up doing that she told me that Ukraine ended up doing? They bought Airbus planes from France. So our workers lost. And I really wish we were having more of that all around the world, including in India. EXIM is getting ready to have a reauthorization process for 2026. President Trump delivered with the Congress the longest reauthorization in EXIM's now 90-year history of 7 years. We worked really hard to get that done. Now it's back again. Have to get it reauthorized again. I would love to see Congress delete a provision in EXIM's charter that was put in during the Vietnam era, so that we can finance the sale of U.S. military goods and services where there's a need. And India knows, the world knows, we make the best, and we want the world buying American and providing that. Since we're at Heritage, I also want to focus briefly on freedom and prosperity. So Dan, at the Atlantic Council, has a center called the Freedom and Prosperity Center, and he does this great index. And I encourage India and every country to take a look at it. They track data, including data that comes out of Heritage, and how you equate prosperity with freedom. And they go hand in hand. And every country can look and see how they rank on that. But I think we need to be driving those messages home from top to bottom. And of course, my favorite, Margaret Thatcher. In 1996, she had a speech where she quoted Goethe, the wonderful German writer, and at a speech, and she quoted him saying, "That which thy fathers bequeathed to thee, earn it anew, if thou would possess it." And then she added, "That is our task, to practice and earn anew the freedom that we have, in which we wish to extend more widely to the whole world." So underlining Dan's work and the work at Heritage, messages go hand in hand.
No, that's very powerful, and obviously we also have our index of economic freedom. And what was very striking to me this year, and we were able to make this presentation in person in Taipei last month, is Taiwan is number 4 on that index. And we come considerably lower. But for the prevailing PRC sort of narrative that the Chinese people are not capable of democracy, they want a strong autocratic hand. What has just happened overnight in Hong Kong is evidence of their trying to implement that, make that narrative a reality. Right across the Taiwan Strait, you have an island of 29 million of the same ethnicity who just had a successful presidential election and are rising with a bullet on the index of economic freedom. So it's simply a lie that the Chinese people are incapable of democracy and freedom. You know, whatever form they would choose to make it, you know, that would be up to them. But I think we can stand up firmly against that lie. Now we have 2 other major topics to get into, one being energy and the other being border and immigration, but I see we're at our time to go to audience questions. So I would very much like to ask you all to start to think of your questions. If you have border and immigration and energy questions, I will be particularly pleased with you and give you a high grade. A hand here, and would you mind introducing yourself and your affiliation?
Thanks for a great discussion. This is Kathy Xue with VOA. But my question is not about energy, but a follow-up question on what Dan has pointed out. So firstly, would you recommend the US administration to call today's CCP as an evil empire? And if yes, there might be a combination of factors, but what would be the fundamental reason or defining character that lead you to that conclusion? And secondly, what prevents today's administration from highlighting the moral element and calling out the CCP's evil nature? And what would be if Reagan were alive, what would be his attitude towards today's CCP? Would he believe that the CCP is like an evil entity and specter that needs to be defeated 100% without ambiguity and possibly eliminated from this earth?
Well, thank you for a fascinating question. So let me first start with the current administration's position towards the People's Republic of China. We say in the book that the Biden administration talks about defining the relationship with China in three ways: competition, cooperation, and confrontation. And then Matt and I add that they are 1/3 right. And what we mean by that is that we don't have a relationship of competition with China, say, in economic affairs, because under the Chinese Communist Party, they lie, cheat, and steal in economic relation. There is an estimate that the loss to the United States in economic relation with China is something like $500 billion. It's a gigantic number. Then a cooperation, again, the Biden administration talks about cooperation in climate and cooperation in health issues. But in climate, the United States, and by the way, Europe also, have seen declines in their emission of CO2, while China is currently increasing emissions and plans to increase emissions. And on COVID, they are not allowing investigation in China on what happened, so it doesn't happen again, and millions of people died. So we don't have that. So then we're left with the confrontation part. And that's why we believe that we are in a Cold War, and the relationship is an adversarial relationship. So this is why the Biden administration doesn't take a strong position in that respect. I think we need to recognize that China is an adversary. I don't know that I would go to calling it an evil empire. It takes someone of Reagan's stature to come up with something like this. Maybe President Trump, because he comes up with these great terms, will come up with something. But we need to call China an adversary. And actually, if you look in the National Defense Authorization Act, actually buried one of the provisions there, Article 800 or something like that, says that countries that are defined by the Commerce Department as adversaries cannot have firms from those countries provide certain services to the Pentagon, and then lists the countries, and China is one of them. So let's at least say it's an adversary, and that would be a step in that right direction.
Can I add a brief comment on this? We also get into this in our chapter on American exceptionalism, because there is a question, is this an ideological competition, or are these just two great powers duking it out? And Dan and I come down on the side that this is an ideological competition, different than during the Cold War, but we need to take seriously that China is not just any country. It's led by the Chinese Communist Party, and that does affect its foreign policy, that affects the threats that it poses. It wouldn't have border disputes with almost all of its neighbors if it were a liberal democracy. It wouldn't be systematically cheating on the international economic system if it were a liberal democracy. and it wouldn't be committing genocide against its own people in Xinjiang if it were a liberal democracy. So I think this is a contest between the United States and the free world, and we stand for a certain set of values that we should be proud of, and that China stands for something very different and worse.